So, frequent free flyer Richard Marles. It'll eventually catch on. Well, today he had his day in Parliament. Of course, this is the man who has been billing taxpayers a grand total of almost $4 million in private jets, most of them for reasonable reasons of ministerial business here and there. But as you know, we've taken some interest that he's decided to use some of these things to fly from party political business in Brisbane to the Matildas in Sydney, back to party political business in Brisbane. None of that in his role as Deputy Prime Minister or Defence Minister, all of it just because he can. Of course, the reporting of Samantha Maiden has been very clear here as well via news.com.au that many of the flights have emanated from or dropped him off in Avalon Airport, and that's not because it's a national security issue, it's because it's an hour closer than Tullamarine is, and it means he wouldn't have to spend as much time in the back of a chauffeur-driven limousine. I mean, seriously, the humanity here. Well, as I say, today, question time. The questions, they came thick and fast for the Deputy Prime Minister, who had many attempts at trying to squeeze out of this. I'm not entirely sure if any of them worked, but here's some of what he was asked by the Shadow Defence Minister.
My question is to the Minister for Defence. Can the Minister confirm whether he has taken his golf clubs with him on any Defence VIP special purpose aircraft flights, and if so, on how many flights? My question is to the Minister for Defence. Can the Minister confirm whether anyone outside of his family, personal or departmental staff have travelled with him on his Defence VIP special purpose aircraft flights?
Now, I would have asked him directly, which is about the specific flight to do with the Matildas, and I would have asked specifically about the constant drop-offs at the airport that's just a little bit closer to home, about why the choice is being made constantly for the taxpayer-funded jet as opposed to the commercially available flights, which leave both Avalon and Tullamarine almost on the hour, every hour, heading towards Sydney, Brisbane or anywhere else in the country. But still, that might be the questions coming up tomorrow. But as for Marles and his defence, well, it wasn't very impressive. But are you surprised? This is the man who, of course, already hands his homework to the Chinese before he gives speeches. This is the man who, of course, said there's no questions at all to answer about the bullying of Kimberley Kitching because we're all mourning her loss, hoping, of course, the story would go away. And, of course, it did. And a large part of the way that this story is going to run is the lack of interest from the rest of the media. Now, it's all because of the terminologies that he's using. The term private jet is not being used. Instead, it's a technical term as to one that is a special service aircraft from the Royal Australian Fire, all of this stuff that's made to make it look like it's far more legitimate than party political activity in Brisbane, fly to a footy game, fly back, cost $16,000. Well, his first answer is nothing to see here.
Let me be very clear. Every place I have been, everything I have done has been in pursuit of my duties as the Deputy Prime Minister and the Minister for Defence on behalf of this country, and I stand absolutely by every flight I have ever taken on the special purpose aircraft, or for that matter, any flight that I have taken commercially.
So why were so many of them dropping you off, the taxpayer-funded ones, at the airport that's just a little bit closer to home, rather than the one which is the main service airport in and out of Melbourne? But then, defence number two, I'm really important.
It begs the question, Mr Speaker, as to what the Leader of the Opposition has to hide, but we have something of an inkling in relation to that by virtue of his behaviour since he's been the Leader of the Opposition, because as the now Minister for Defence, my office has logged numerous requests from the Leader of the Opposition about him going on special purpose aircraft, including in the last 6 weeks 2 times at least in writing to go to a game of the Matildas.
Oh, I know you are, but what am I? That's literally the defence that was offered today. By the way, he did take his golf clubs, but he wouldn't say it in the Parliament because he knows how they would look. The reason? Well, that, of course, was briefed out to journalists who have largely not reported the story, or were more than happy to turn around and say, oh, that's because he was playing golf with the Defence Minister of Taiwan. And the issue in and around the Matildas flight, well, he was one of many, and Peter Dutton also asked, so there's nothing to see here, nothing to see here. Remember, travel rorts used to kill Australian politicians, but when it's a Labor politician, you're allowed to get away with rubbish like this.
The guidelines that are in place I completely comply with, but so do every other person in the government who uses the special purpose aircraft, and I absolutely stand by the way in which all persons on this side have complied with those guidelines. Again, let me be clear. The special purpose aircraft is a critical function which those opposite well know, which facilitates government travel.
Special purpose aircraft, special purpose aircraft. See, national security, there's something more than just travel routes about this. I'm important, don't you know? I know you are, but what am I? There's nothing to see here. But remember, the only time you're supposed to use the taxpayer-funded flight is if there is not a commercial one available. Is Richard Marles honestly trying to pretend that every single choice that he made was because there wasn't a commercial flight available? Now, I know that there's other places to fly from Avalon than to Sydney, but if he was flying to Sydney, there's a flight at 6 a.m, at 10:30 a.m, at 2:50 p.m, and 4:10 p.m. The range of cost of those flights is as cheap as $58 or as expensive as $148, which is why I keep talking about why did so many of these things take off and land from the airport that happens to be closer to his house on the edges of Geelong than the one where you would presume the commercially available flights were coming in and out of, and that was Melbourne. Just an hour down the road, and that's a crippling hour. So the taxpayer should be paying way more than just $58 a flight because I'm important, don't you know? The work that I would do on the phone in the back of the car, well, I have to do it from the middle of the skies with the special communications tools that they have. And when it comes to how many flights come out of Melbourne to Sydney, it won't surprise you. There's no excuse why he can't catch one of the 80 different flights and pay for it via the taxpayer with flights between 5:24 in the morning and 9 p.m. from Melbourne to Sydney, with as little as $79, or if he wants the champagne, the back rub and the cuddle from Alan Joyce, it's $980, which I would imagine is still way cheaper than if it was him and his staff that were flying on the special purpose vehicle that was flying from Avalon, which is closer to where he lives because it's more convenient than the airport that's got 80 flights a day from Sydney to Melbourne and Melbourne to Sydney. But despite the fact that it was the lead question in question time, despite the fact that the answer was so non-specific, despite the fact that there are plenty of questions to answer, what was the coverage on the 6 p.m. news tonight? Oh, that's right, duck egg, nothing. When they weren't just doing a sales job for the IR laws or talking about the voice referendum, there's nothing to see here. And remember, our mate Bronwyn Bishop had to pay back $5,000 for one use of a helicopter from Melbourne to a party political event that was up around Geelong. He is using the taxpayer-funded flight from party political Brisbane to football in Sydney, back to party political event in Brisbane, which cost $16,000. But nothing to see here, nothing to see here. But even when that is the case, about whether it is or isn't inside the guidelines, and believe it or not, the Bronwyn Bishop flight was within the guidelines. In the early days of her appearances on this program, she showed all of the rules that said it was actually technically within the bounds. But as we know, there's this mythical other thing that gets brought in when even it's within the rules to pursue politicians who do things that are just not really explainable.
So does this budget pass the pub test?
Doesn't pass the pub test.
It doesn't pass the pub test.
She didn't pass the pub test.
Doesn't pass the pub test.
There truly is a pub test.
And of course it was the pub test that did him Bronwyn Bishop, but apparently it's the pub with no interest. Not as good as the pub with no beer, but you get the point when it comes to the wider media. Well, interestingly, there is a little further information I want to tell you about tonight about why this may well end up becoming an issue again tomorrow, despite the fact the 6 p.m. news doesn't want to talk about it because they're talking about it on Sky News. And if they're talking about it on Sky News primetime, then we must not talk about it. It's not a real story. Despite the fact that it is as clear as day what the story is here. Am I suggesting that he should lose his job over this? No. Do I think he should pay back some of these flights? Hell yes. Do I think that he should go through the indignity of going on a chauffeur-driven trip from his house to Melbourne to catch a commercial flight? Yes, because that's the option that should be first, second, third. And if he can't find any other way of doing it because he's out the back of Burke or he's on his way to Broome, then yeah, the taxpayer can pick it up. It is not national security. which of course has been one of the many reasons why we've been told we can't know about any of the flight logs here. National security, national security. Well, Samantha Maiden, who is staying on with this, and I'm glad she is, she's filed tonight that Miles could be forced to hand over the secret information via a process which is going to play out in the Senate. We will watch this space, we will keep talking, and he might want to update his answer from, I know you are, but what am I? And I'm really important, and I stand by all of it. Can you tell us what all of it was? No, of course not. National security.